Great Expectations, Chapter 2. My sister, Mrs. Joe Gargery, was more than 20 years older than I, and had established a great reputation with herself and the neighbours because she had brought me up by hand. Knowing her to have a hard and heavy hand, and to be much in the habit of laying it upon her husband as well as upon me, I suppose that Joe Gargery and I were both brought up by hand. She was not a good-looking woman, my sister, and I had a general impression that she must have made Joe Gargery marry her by hand. Joe was a fair man, with curls of flaxen hair on each side of his smooth face, and with eyes of such a very undecided blue that they seemed to have somehow got mixed with their own whites. He was a mild, good-natured, sweet-tempered, easy-going, foolish, dear fellow, a sort of Hercules in strength, and also in weakness. My sister, Mrs. Joe, with black hair and eyes, had such a redness of skin that I sometimes used to wonder whether it was possible she washed herself with a nutmeg grater instead of soap. She was tall and bony, and almost always wore a coarse apron, and having a square impregnable bib in front that was stuck full of pins and needles. Joe's forge adjoined our house. When I ran home from the churchyard, the forge was shut up, and Joe was sitting alone in the kitchen. Mrs. Joe had been out a dozen times looking for you, Pip, and what's worse, she's got Tickler with her. Tickler was a wax-ended piece of cane, worn smooth by collision with my tickled frame. "Rampaged out, that's what she did," said Joe, slowly clearing the fire between the lower bars with the poker. "She rampaged out, Pip." "Has she been gone long, Joe?" I always treated him as a larger species of child, and as no more than my equal. "Well," said Joe, "she's been on the rampage, Pip. She's a-coming. Get behind the door, old chap, and have the jack-towel betwixt you." I took the advice, my sister throwing the door wide open, and finding an obstruction behind it, immediately divined the cause and applied Tickler. She concluded by throwing me, I often served as a connubial missile, at Joe, who, glad to get hold of me, passed me on into the chimney and quietly fenced me up there with his great leg. "Where have you been, you young monkey?" said Mrs. Joe, stamping her foot. "I've only been in the churchyard," said I from my stool, crying and rubbing myself. I looked disconsolately at the fire. For the fugitive out on the marshes with the ironed leg, the mysterious young man, the file, the food, and the dreadful pledge I was under to commit a larceny on those sheltering premises, rose before me in the avenging coals. My sister had a trenchant way of cutting our bread and butter for us, that never varied. First, she jammed the loaf hard and fast against her bib, where it sometimes got a pin into it and sometimes a needle, which we afterwards got into our mouths. Then she took some butter and spread it on the loaf in an apothecary kind of way, as if she were making a plaster, using both sides of the knife with a slapping dexterity, and trimming and moulding the butter off round the crust. Though I was hungry, I dared not eat my slice. I felt that I must have something in reserve for my dreadful acquaintance, and his ally, the still more dreadful young man. Therefore I resolved to put my hunk of bread and butter down the leg of my trousers. I took advantage of a moment when Joe had just looked at me and got my bread and butter down my leg. Joe was evidently made uncomfortable by what he supposed to be my loss of appetite, and took a thoughtful bite out of his slice, which he didn't seem to enjoy. He turned it about in his mouth much longer than usual, pondering over it a good deal, and after all gulped it down like a pill. He was about to take another bite when he saw that my bread and butter was gone, The wonder and consternation with which Joe stopped on the threshold of his bite and stared at me were too evident to escape my sister's observation. "What's the matter now?" she said smartly. "I say, you know," muttered Joe, shaking his head at me. "Pip, old chap, you'll do yourself a mischief. It'll stick somewhere. You can't have chawed it, Pip." "What's the matter now?" repeated my sister, more sharply than before. "If you can cough any trifle on it up, Pip, I'd recommend you to do it," said Joe, all aghast. "Manners is manners, but still, your health's your health." This time my sister pounced on Joe, and taking him by the two whiskers, knocked his head for a little while against the wall behind him, while I sat on in the corner, looking guiltily on. "Now, perhaps you'll mention what's the matter," said my sister, out of breath. "You staring great stuck pig." "You know, Pip," said Joe solemnly, with his last bite in his cheek, and speaking in a confidential voice as if we two were quite alone, "you and me is always friends, and I'd be the last to tell upon you, but such a—" he moved his chair and looked about the floor between us and then again at me. "Such a most uncommon bolt as that." "Been bolting his food, has he?" cried my sister. "You know, old chap," said Joe, looking at me and not at Mrs. Joe, with his bite still in his cheek, "I bolted myself when I was your age frequent, but I never see your bolting equal yet, Pip, and it's a mercy you ain't bolted dead." My sister made a dive at me and fished me up by the hair, saying nothing more than the awful words, "You come along and be dosed." Some medical beast had revived tar water in those days as a fine medicine, and Mrs. Joe always kept a supply of it in the cupboard, having a belief in its virtues correspondent to its nastiness. At the best of times, so much of this elixir was administered to me as a choice restorative that I was conscious of going about smelling like a new fence. The urgency of my case demanded a pint of this mixture, which was poured down my throat for my greater comfort, while Mrs. Joe held my head under her arm as a boot would be held in a boot jack. Joe got off with a half pint, but was made to swallow that because he had had a turn. Conscience is a dreadful thing, but when in the case of a boy that secret burden cooperates with another secret burden down the leg of his trousers, it is a great punishment. The guilty knowledge that I was going to rob Mrs. Joe, united to the necessity of always keeping one hand on my bread and butter as I sat, almost drove me out of my mind. It was Christmas Eve, and I had to stir the pudding for next day with a copper stick from 7 to 8 by the Dutch clock. I tried it with the load upon my leg, and that made me think afresh of the man with the load on his leg, and found the tendency of exercise to bring the bread and butter out at my ankle quite unmanageable. "Hark," said I, when I had done my stirring and was taking a final warm in the chimney corner before being sent up to bed. "That was great guns, Joe. Oh, sorry. Was that great guns, Joe?" "Ah," said Joe, "there's another convict off." "What does that mean, Joe?" said I. Mrs. Joe, who always took explanations upon herself, said snappishly, "Escaped! Escaped!" "There was a convict off last night," said Joe aloud, "after sunset gun, and they fired warning of him, and now it appears they're firing warning of another." "Who's firing?" said I. "I should like to know, if you wouldn't much mind, where the firing comes from." "Lord bless the boy!" exclaimed my sister, as if she didn't quite mean that, but rather the contrary. "From the hulks!" "And please, what's hulks?" said I. "That's the way with this boy," exclaimed my sister, pointing me out with her needle and thread, and shaking her head at me. "Answer him one question, and he'll ask you a dozen directly. Hulks are prison ships, right across the meshes." We always use that name for marshes in our country. "I wonder who's put into prison ships, and why they're put there," said I, with quiet desperation. It was too much for Mrs. Joe. People are put in the hulks because they murder and because they rob and forge and do all sorts of bad. And they always begin by asking questions. Now, you get along to bed. I was in mortal terror of the young man who wanted my heart and liver. I was in mortal terror of my interlocutor with the iron leg. I was in mortal terror of myself, from whom an awful promise had been extracted. I was afraid to sleep, for I knew that in the first faint dawn of morning I must rob the pantry. As soon as the great black velvet pall outside my little window was shot with grey, I got up and went downstairs. And every crack in every board calling after me, "Stop, thief, and get up, Mrs. Joe!" In the pantry, which was far more abundantly supplied than usual, owing to the season, I stole some bread, some rind of cheese, and about a jar of mincemeat. Some brandy from a stone bottle, which I decanted into a glass bottle, diluting the stone bottle from the jug in the kitchen cupboard, a meat bone with very little on it, and a beautiful round compact pork pie. And I got a file from among Joe's tools. Then I opened the door at which I had entered when I ran home last night, shut it, and ran for the misty marshes.